The briefing room aboard the GES Sentinel smelled of stale air and too many nervous soldiers. Commander Keller paced slowly in front of the lineup, his boots making dull sounds against the metal floor. Every soldier watched him closely, except for one. Private Mercer sat slouched in the last seat, picking at a scuff mark on his boot. He didn't look special. Average height, mousy brown hair, plain face, nothing memorable at all. Keller pointed at Mercer. "That one right there is why. We're still breathing." A few soldiers glanced at Mercer with doubt in their eyes. Mercer didn't notice or pretended not to. He just kept rubbing at that scuff mark. 3 months earlier, humanity had learned the Zandari weren't just making empty threats when they parked a fleet larger than Australia in orbit around Earth. Their first message wasn't a negotiation. It was a countdown. World leaders barely had time to respond before Mumbai vanished under a flash of purple light. The war that followed was short, bloody, and messy. By all accounts, humanity should have lost. They had no energy shields, no plasma, weapons, no battle fleets older than civilization itself. Just stubbornness, makeshift solutions, and people like Mercer. "You think war is won by your loudest people?" Keller asked. "By the ones with shiny armor and big guns? No, wars are won by the one person nobody bothers to search." He paused to let that sink in. Some younger recruits shifted uncomfortably. Perhaps they were thinking of Sergeant Voss, built like a truck and twice as tough. Voss had been vaporized 2 weeks into the war. Mercer finally looked up, scratching his nose. It was hard to describe his face because no one remembered it long. Enough. Not ugly, not handsome, not anything remarkable. Which made him deadly. Humanity's first real breakthrough came after the siege of Nova Prime, the Zandari's fortified colony world. No army had ever broken through its defenses. Soldiers died there by the thousands. So Earth Command sent in a special squad. The squad failed completely. They got trapped, called for rescue, and died under enemy fire. Then Mercer volunteered. Nobody even noticed him leave the damaged transport ship. 1 minute he was fumbling with a food pack, the next he was gone. He walked into the enemy city wearing a stolen technician's uniform, dragging a dented toolbox. The Zandari didn't look twice at him. Why would they? They stood 9 feet tall with jaws like steel traps, covered in natural armor thick enough to stop artillery shells. Mercer looked like a mosquito, something so small it begged to be ignored. And he was ignored. He slipped through doorways, climbed maintenance shafts, and followed power lines. Days passed. High Command assumed he was dead. His squad, certainly. Thought so, until Nova Prime exploded. The report was confusing. Mercer had found the central reactor complex. He didn't fight a glorious battle or plant bombs in a daring raid. He just unplugged it. Literally opened a maintenance panel, looked at a humming coil, shrugged, and pulled out a few critical components. Red lights flashed. Alarms screamed. Entire systems collapsed in chain reactions. By the time the Zandari realized something was wrong, it was too late. Nova Prime tore itself apart from the inside, all because one man knew how to be invisible. They didn't even list him on the official casualty reports, Keller said, running a hand over his short hair. Said they didn't know where he was, even after he walked back into camp 2 days later, still eating a food bar like nothing happened. A few recruits laughed awkwardly. "The point is," Keller continued, "you're too busy looking for the loud ones. You think you need to be a hero to win? You don't. You just need to make sure nobody notices you until it's too late." Mercer sneezed, startling those sitting nearby. He wiped his nose and went back to staring at nothing. When the final push against the Zandari home fleet began, Mercer wasn't at the front lines. He barely appeared on any roster. Instead, he was quietly reassigned to Special Task Group 7. They didn't even have a patch. Their orders were simple: end the war. The Zandari had moved their command center to the Colossus, the largest ship in the galaxy. A floating city bristling with weapons and defended by millions. Direct attack was suicide. Infiltration seemed impossible unless you had someone who could walk through their defenses like a lost janitor. The team inserted near the outer hull. Marines fought furiously to clear a path. Explosions lit up space. Fighter ships darted like angry wasps. None of that mattered. The real battle happened in the shadows, through broken maintenance corridors and forgotten decks. Mercer walked at the front, hands in his pockets. Zandari patrols thundered past while Mercer kept his head down, muttering to himself in broken alien phrases he'd picked up from service manuals. Guards glanced at him, grunted, and dismissed him as unimportant. The deeper they went, the worse their chances became. Other team members peeled away, handling secondary objectives or falling to enemy fire. Soon it was just Mercer and Lieutenant Rain, an older soldier who didn't ask questions anymore. At the heart of the Colossus was the command core, a pulsing transparent sphere half a mile wide, laced with circuits and glowing tendrils. It seemed almost alive, breathing. Somewhere inside, the Zandari High Commander directed the war. "How do you even shut something like that down?" Rain whispered from behind a support beam. Mercer shrugged. He set down his toolbox and took out a single device, an old, battered electromagnetic pulse grenade. He tossed it lightly in his hand as if deciding whether to use it. "That's it?" Rain hissed. "You think that'll work?" Mercer didn't answer. He stepped into the open, fully visible to two Zandari guards posted at the core's entrance. One barked a challenge. Mercer tripped on purpose, sprawling across the floor and scattering tools. The Zandari hesitated, just a clumsy maintenance worker, not worth their time. As they turned back to their posts, Mercer palmed the grenade and gently rolled it toward the core. The world exploded in silence. Energy rippled out like a tidal wave. Lights flickered. Systems screamed and died. The command core cracked like an egg, releasing a pulse that raced through every wire and circuit, destroying systems catastrophically. The Zandari High Commander reportedly disintegrated along with half the Colossus's brain. As alarms blared and the massive vessel began to tilt, Mercer dusted off his pants, gathered his scattered tools, and shuffled toward the extraction point. When the human fleet saw the Colossus lurch and go dark, when its weapons failed and its escort ship spun into chaos, they pressed the attack. Victory came suddenly, brutally, and completely. "So next time you look for a hero," Commander Keller finished with a dry smile, "don't watch the person flexing in the mirror. Watch the one fumbling with their shoes." Private Mercer yawned loudly from the back row, stood up, and shuffled out of the room, already forgotten by most of the wide-eyed recruits who would someday owe him their lives. A week after the Colossus fell, the Zandari were still reeling. Human forces pressed every advantage, and for the first time since the war began, the Zandari retreated. They abandoned smoldering colonies, orbital platforms, and shipyards once thought unbreakable. Across briefing rooms and war councils, one phrase passed in hushed tones. Not Mercer's name, but the incident itself. The ghost who had slipped through their fingers and struck at the heart of their fleet without firing a shot. It wasn't over, though, not even close. Earth Command intercepted desperate Zandari transmissions. One word kept repeating in their harsh language: resurrection. Analysts weren't sure what it meant at first. Maybe regrouping, maybe some kind of ceremonial last stand. Whatever it was, the Zandari weren't surrendering. They were gathering at Vortex, an ancient star fortress at the edge of known space, older than any Zandari ship still in service. A relic from their first wars of conquest, Vortex wasn't just a fortress, it was a statement. If they were going to die, they would die where no enemy had ever set foot. Command wanted that foot to be human. The Sentinel docked with the Titan-class carrier GES Indomitable for the next phase of operations. Commander Keller was summoned to the upper decks for planning sessions he hated. He left Sergeant Pike in charge, a thick-skulled fighter who believed bigger guns meant better diplomacy. The soldiers complained under his command, but orders were orders. Mercer, predictably, vanished from the duty roster entirely, not discharged, not transferred, just omitted. Most assumed he was dead. Only a few suspected otherwise. Rain was one of them. After returning from the Colossus mission, Rain hadn't said much about what happened. Now, while others drank or argued in the mess hall, he spent hours examining logistics reports, personnel transfers, and ship manifests. Mercer's name never appeared, but supply shipments to Special Task Group 7 increased by 20%. Something was brewing. It broke open during the second assault on Vortex's outer defenses. Human Marines landed in waves, hammering at Ancient. Shield arrays and towers bristling with weapons. Losses were catastrophic. Every corridor became a bloodbath. The fortress wasn't just built to keep enemies out. It was built to grind them into dust. The Zandari fought with savage joy, roaring their ancient war songs into communication channels as they pushed back wave after wave. Human commanders rotated. Fresh troops every few hours just to maintain pressure, but it wasn't sustainable. By the third day, morale plummeted. Even hardened veterans whispered about retreat. Then came a different plan. It wasn't announced over main channels. No speeches, no formal operation orders, just a few coded messages between fleet intelligence officers, a quiet reshuffling of units, and the appearance of one damaged supply shuttle limping through the debris field toward the planet's dark side. Inside the shuttle, Private Mercer, wearing a technician's uniform 2 sizes too big, whistling tunelessly as he checked a wrist device cobbled together from 3 different models. Rain wasn't supposed to know about this, but he did. He wasn't supposed to follow, but he did that too. While the main forces hammered Vortex's obvious defenses, Mercer slipped through a maintenance hatch abandoned during the first Zandari Wars and never properly sealed. It was the kind of oversight no proud warrior species would ever imagine could be exploited. Rain crept behind him, trying not to breathe too loudly. Mercer didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he did and simply didn't care. He moved like a ghost, hugging shadows, navigating the fortress's insides through pure instinct. Once, 3 Zandari engineers nearly ran into them while turning a corner with heavy repair equipment. Rain tensed, reaching for his weapon. Mercer simply ducked behind a leaking cooling pipe and let the aliens pass, unseeing. They reached an ancient control room half buried under collapsed corridors. Cracked screens flickered with status updates. The air smelled of ozone and dust. It wasn't much to look at. Certainly nothing a general would consider valuable, which was exactly the point. Mercer knelt before a corroded console and produced a small device from his kit, a pulse worm. Illegal on Earth, but nobody cared about. Legality when survival was at stake. The pulse worm would infect any active system with a silent chain of logic bombs, waiting for a signal. Rain watched in disbelief as Mercer casually inserted the device into an access port. "You're going to bring down the whole fortress from here?" Rain whispered, stunned. Mercer didn't answer. He simply checked his wrist device again and nodded almost to himself. Then he pulled out a second device, much cruder, an ancient remote detonator wired to a simple EMP surge pack. "Backup systems," he muttered without looking up, "in case they notice." The whole thing took 5 minutes. No gunfire, no battles, no inspiring speeches. As Mercer packed up his kit, Rain finally found his voice. "Why you?" he asked, genuinely confused. "Why not send anyone else?" Mercer looked at him then. A slow, tired gaze like someone seeing a person he barely remembered. "Because I'm the only one they still won't see coming." Before Rain could respond, the corridor behind them shook violently. Explosions rumbled through the walls, distant but growing louder. A squad of Zandari guards stormed into view, weapons raised. For once, Rain was faster. He grabbed Mercer by the collar and pulled him behind a collapsed wall. The firefight was brutal and one-sided. Rain fired short, controlled bursts, forcing the Zandari to take cover. Mercer, meanwhile, calmly accessed his wrist device, tracking the pulseworm's progress through the fortress systems. "Little busy here," Rain shouted as energy bolts sizzled. Overhead, Mercer pressed a final command. Somewhere deep in Vortex's core, automated lockdown routines triggered. Blast doors slammed shut. Defense turrets inside the fortress pivoted wrongly, targeting their own personnel. Power systems overloaded. The fortress began tearing itself apart from within. The Zandari guards, realizing too late that something was catastrophically wrong, abandoned the fight. They sprinted back toward the core. Mercer and Rain took the chance and ran. As they stumbled through collapsing corridors and failing gravity fields, Rain shouted over the noise, "You realize Command's going to think this was an accident?" Mercer smiled slightly, just a small twitch at the corner of his mouth. "Good," he said. "That's the idea." They burst out onto the surface just as Vortex's upper towers buckled inward, releasing fire and debris into the polluted sky. Drop ships circled like vultures, picking up the few survivors and the soldiers too stubborn to die. From orbit, the human fleet watched in stunned silence as the greatest fortress in Zandari history collapsed like wet paper. Orders scrambled. Attacks shifted. Within hours, the remaining Zandari resistance crumbled into confusion, and deep in the mass of transmissions, one encrypted signal repeated quietly. "Mission complete." Awaiting further instructions. In the aftermath, the Zandari fleets splintered. Without command coordination, their mighty ships became wandering relics. Their captains were paralyzed between pride and terror. Human forces took colony after colony, barely meeting resistance. The few Zandari who did stand their ground fought fiercely, but without the cold, tactical precision of their former leaders, they were outmaneuvered, outgunned, and overwhelmed. Yet even with victory in sight, Earth Command worried. The Zandari had a reputation for last stands, desperate acts of final vengeance. Their culture demanded it. Somewhere deep among the remnants of their empire, a weapon was being prepared. A final blow meant to cripple humanity even in defeat. Command needed someone to find it, someone the Zandari would never see coming. 3 days later, Private Mercer sat in the back of a battered troop shuttle, hunched over a food bar, staring blankly at the floor. No briefing, no fanfare, just a nod from an officer who didn't even make eye contact. The destination was a barren moon called Dusk Haven, little more than a rocky sphere orbiting a dying gas giant. Early scans showed abandoned Zandari technology installations buried beneath its surface, vast, silent, and power-starved. Mercer stepped off the shuttle alone. He wandered through the broken complexes, his only light coming from occasional flickers of dying emergency beacons. Metallic wind howled through empty corridors. Crates of ancient weapons sat untouched, their deadly payloads useless without guidance systems, silent monuments to a fallen empire. Most would have felt fear. Mercer just felt tired. Hours passed. He moved methodically, searching for signs of life or purpose. At last, in a deep underground chamber, he found it. A massive device, alien in every sense, humming softly. A final weapon. It pulsed with quiet menace, feeding off, the last trickle of energy the moon could provide. Standing guard was a single Zandari warrior, larger than any Mercer had ever seen, wearing ceremonial armor blackened by the ashes of past battles. His hands gripped a long, cruel spear that hummed with contained energy. The warrior didn't roar. He didn't posture. He just watched Mercer approach. "You are the Shadow!" the Zandari rumbled, speaking rough, broken English. "The nothing that devours giants." Mercer said nothing. He slipped his hand into his pocket and palmed a compact scrambler. "You dishonor battle," the Zandari continued, raising his spear. "No blade, no fire, only decay and silence." Still, Mercer said nothing. He stepped forward. The warrior charged. In old tales, battles were decided by strength, skill, or rage. In reality, most battles were decided by one side doing something the other never expected. Mercer dropped the scrambler at his feet. The spear, mid-swing, shorted. Out instantly, its energy blade vanishing with a sad whine. The physical force of the warrior's charge still hit Mercer like a train, knocking him across the dusty floor. Bones cracked. Blood filled his mouth. He tasted copper pain, but he smiled through it because as the warrior loomed over him, ready to tear him apart with bare hands, the ancient systems around them groaned. The scrambler, feeding into the facility's decayed systems, triggered every lockdown failsafe and override command still buried in the machine's primitive code. The weapon began a slow, irreversible shutdown. The Zandari howled, not in anger but in sorrow, as centuries of preparation died in an instant. Mercer staggered to his feet, bruised, broken, but breathing. The warrior sank to his knees, defeated by nothing more than a forgotten man with a broken machine. Mercer limped back to the shuttle. No parades awaited him. No grand announcements echoed through fleet channels. He left behind no monument, no glorious battle scene to be remembered. But when the Zandari finally surrendered, when the great warrior clans lowered their banners and knelt before the least likely victors, it wasn't the names of admirals or heroes they whispered about in fear. It was the man nobody ever noticed, the one they still didn't quite believe was real. Back aboard the Sentinel, Commander Keller sipped a cup of bitter coffee as he watched the surrender ceremonies flicker across the view screen. Around him, young recruits cheered and laughed, clinking drinks and slapping each other on the back. Only Keller stayed quiet, his eyes narrowing as he spotted a familiar figure slipping unnoticed through the crowd, heading for the supply deck. Private Mercer, once again forgotten before anyone could even say his name, Keller smiled faintly into his cup. "Good," he muttered. "Let them keep forgetting. It's the only reason we're still standing."